My name is Carol Bennett. I am an ICU nurse, and for 30 years I was married to the kindest, most methodical man I have ever known, Dennis Bennett. When I found the file 8 months after Dennis died, I realized I had known almost nothing at all. It was in the hidden compartment of his 1965 Shelby Cobra replica, the car he spent 20 years of his life building, the one he called his mechanical therapy. My hands were shaking as I pulled the thin manila folder from the dark, oil-scented recess he'd engineered into the custom paneling of the car door. It was wedged between the leather and the frame, sealed shut with a rubber band. I wasn't supposed to be in the garage at all. After Dennis passed, the scent of motor oil and sawdust was too sharp a grief trigger. It was Tom Graves, Dennis's best friend and the co-owner of the garage, who insisted I come out that day. He'd helped Dennis install that hidden compartment years ago, though Dennis had never told him what was inside. Tom just said, "Dennis told me if anything ever happened, you know where to look." I sat in the driver's seat of the Shelby, a shrine to my husband's patient love and labor, and opened the folder. Inside, it wasn't a last will or an insurance policy. It was a private investigation file. The first page was a cover sheet typed, "Subject, Vanessa Cortland. Status, active investigation." The blood drained from my face. Vanessa Cortland, my son Brian Bennett's new wife, the woman I was just starting to accept 8 months after Dennis's fatal heart attack, had now become a central figure in his secret final project. I quickly flipped through the contents. Photos, not of my son and Vanessa, but of Vanessa with other men. Marriage certificates. Vanessa Cortland married to Stanley Wright. Vanessa Cortland married to George Murphy. There were dates, details on finances, property health, and contact information scribbled on the back of one sheet. Phone numbers for Stanley Wright in Phoenix and George Murphy in Tampa. And at the very bottom of Dennis's last note, written in his familiar, precise hand, was the final, devastating sentence. "Need more concrete proof before telling Brian. He won't believe me without it. She's too skilled. If you're reading this and I'm gone, please finish what I started. Protect our son." I closed the folder and held it against my chest, the rough manila scratching my silk blouse. 8 months. 8 months of me thinking I knew everything about our life together, everything about the man I slept beside for 3 decades. 8 months of missing him, grieving him, believing his last days were peaceful. Instead, he had been carrying this alone. Tears came then, deep, racking sobs that shook my whole body. It wasn't the quiet, dignified weeping of a widow. It was the raw, guttural grief of a woman realizing her husband had died in a private war, a war he couldn't share. I sat in Dennis's car, holding his investigation file, and wept for everything he tried to do, everything he risked to save our son. Tom came back after a few minutes, stood in the doorway of the garage, and didn't say anything. He just waited, sensing the magnitude of what I had found. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, got out of the car, and looked at him. "He was protecting me," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. Even after he died, he was still protecting us. Tom nodded, his expression a mixture of profound sorrow and unwavering loyalty. That's who Dennis was, Carol, always thinking 3 steps ahead. The fog of grief lifted, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I gripped the file tighter. I need to call these men. Stanley and George. I need to know what happened to them. I need to know the truth he died trying to find. "You can use my office," Tom offered, gesturing toward the small, private room at the back of the garage. "Take all the time you need. I'll make sure no one bothers you." I looked from Tom to the magnificent Shelby, the car Dennis spent 20 years building. I stared at the secret compartment he'd installed with his friend, at the investigation he'd left for me to finish. The tears were gone. They had been replaced by a quiet fury. "She's not going to get away with this," I vowed. "No," Tom said, his voice flat and certain. "She's not." I stepped into Tom's office, closing the door firmly behind me. I placed the file on the desk, the photographs and certificates spread out before me like pieces of a terrible puzzle. My hands were shaking, but this time it was from adrenaline, not fear. I picked up the phone and dialed the first number, Stanley Wright, Phoenix. Stanley Wright answered on the third ring. His voice sounded tired, profoundly weighted, as if he'd been expecting this call for years, a ghost waiting for his summons. "Hello, Mr. Wright. My name is Carol Bennett. I'm calling because my son is married to a woman named Vanessa Cortland." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint, hollow sound of air moving in his receiver. Then, a heavy sigh, one that seemed to carry the weight of a monumental loss. "I wondered when this call would come," Stanley finally said. I gripped the edge of Tom's desk, my knuckles white. "Can you tell me what happened?" Stanley was 58 years old, and he told his story slowly, methodically. Each word was careful, precise, as if he had practiced this monologue for years, preparing for the moment someone would finally ask. He met Vanessa in the spring of 2019 at a local community center where his elderly mother volunteered. Vanessa was helping organize events, charming, attentive, effortlessly captivating. She seemed genuinely interested in him, in his life, his work, his past. His wife had died 3 years before, and Stanley was desperately lonely, navigating the isolating landscape of sudden, late-life widowerhood. They started dating. She was patient, understanding, and made him feel seen again, truly seen, for the first time since his wife passed. He felt like he had been granted a reprieve, a second chance at happiness he didn't deserve. He proposed 6 months later. His mother, a woman with a sharp, intuitive mind, had concerns. She told Stanley something felt off about Vanessa, something calculating behind her bright smile. Stanley, blinded by gratitude and affection, dismissed it. He thought his mother was simply being overprotective or maybe a little jealous. He convinced himself it was just the normal friction of introducing a new woman into the family. They married. And shortly after the wedding, Vanessa began phase 1 of her operation. It started with small, insidious comments about Stanley's mother. "Your mother seems to be slowing down, Stanley." "Have you noticed? She forgot my name yesterday. Is that normal? I'm worried about her driving, honey. What if something happens when she's alone?" Vanessa never presented it as an accusation or a demand, but as a genuine, loving concern for his mother's well-being. Stanley, already primed to notice his mother's aging process, began to see normal aging as a sudden, sharp decline. Vanessa would subtly find articles about early-onset dementia, articles about elderly falls and injury risks, and leave them where Stanley would see them, usually on the kitchen counter or tucked into the newspaper. Over the course of a few months, she carefully, brilliantly built a case in Stanley's mind that his mother wasn't just aging, but was actively unsafe. Then she found the facility, a memory care unit, the best in the state, she insisted, with a price tag of $20,000 a month. "She deserves the best, Stanley," Vanessa would coo, "but the only way to afford it is to sell her house." Stanley, now convinced that this move was for his mother's own safety and well-being, convinced her it was time. He sold the house she had lived in for 42 years. It went quickly for $280,000. The money, Vanessa said, needed to be easily accessible for care expenses, so it went into a joint account she opened with Stanley. His mother moved into the beautiful clinical facility a few months after the wedding. 2 weeks later, Vanessa disappeared. Stanley's voice cracked on the line. Cleaned out the account, every penny, left no forwarding address, changed her phone number. She just vanished. He tried to track her. He filed police reports, but the money was in a joint account with his wife. Technically, legally, it was his money, too. The police treated it as a domestic dispute, a runaway wife. Stanley couldn't prove she had committed a crime. 6 months later, his mother died. "She kept asking when she could go home, Mrs. Bennett," Stanley choked out, the sound of a grown man breaking. "I kept telling her soon, but there was no home anymore and no money to get her one." My eyes closed. I felt the sharp sting of guilt for my husband and a profound, chilling realization of the woman we were dealing with. "I'm so sorry, Stanley." "My mom was fine, Mrs. Bennett. A little forgetful, yes, but she was fine. She didn't need that place. She needed her home." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "Whatever Vanessa is telling your son about you, don't believe it, Document everything. She'll start small little comments about you forgetting things, being tired. Then she'll escalate. Thank you for telling me. Stop her, Stanley said, his voice now a desperate plea. Please don't let her do to another family what she did to mine. She's evil. I hung up the phone and sat there, staring at the sterile wall of Tom's office. Tom walked in immediately, silent, and brought me a glass of water. I drank it in 2 desperate gulps, the cold water chilling my core. The phone felt heavy in my hand as I dialed the second number. George Murphy, Tampa. George Murphy answered immediately. George Murphy, he said, his voice deep, gravelly, and instantly weary. I introduced myself, using the exact same opening words. My name is Carol Bennett. I'm calling because my son is married to a woman named Vanessa Cortland. He sighed, the sound echoing the weariness I had heard from Stanley Wright, only deeper, heavier, perhaps fueled by stronger anger. Vanessa Cortland, yeah, I've been waiting for someone to call. George was 61. His story was different in details, but the pattern was chillingly, undeniably the same. He met Vanessa in early 2021 at his father's funeral. She wasn't family. She was there, she claimed, supporting a friend of the deceased. She found George afterward, raw, devastated, and completely alone in his grief. She expressed her condolences, saying she understood what he was going through, that she had lost someone close to her, too. They talked for hours that evening. She didn't try to distract him. She just listened, letting him unload the weight of his sorrow. She helped him navigate the darkest time of his life, becoming an anchor in a storm of sadness. They started dating a month later. His friends warned him it was too soon, that he was vulnerable. He didn't care. Vanessa made the grief bearable. She was soft, present, and always said the exact right thing. He felt she was a gift, a miracle placed in his life by a benevolent, grieving fate. They married 8 months later. George's father had owned a small, successful auto repair shop for 40 years, a legacy of hard work and integrity. George inherited it, but he didn't want to run it. Too many memories of his father, the scent of oil and gasoline bringing back wave after wave of pain. Vanessa suggested selling. It's too much stress, darling, she told him gently. You need to heal, sell it. We'll take the money, travel, heal together, and start fresh somewhere beautiful. It made perfect, undeniable sense to George at the time. He sold the shop for $195,000. It was a good, quick sale. The money, just like with Stanley, went immediately into a joint account she assured him was necessary for their joint financial planning. 3 days after the check cleared, Vanessa was gone, completely vanished. George, being slightly younger and more financially savvy than Stanley, tracked her through early credit card records all the way to Costa Rica. He flew down there, consumed by a blend of denial and desperation. But by the time he arrived, the money was gone. She had laundered it through multiple accounts, making it impossible to recover. She was, he realized, a professional predator. She targets men with aging parents and family assets, George stated, his voice now regaining a hard, sharp edge of certainty. That's her specialty. She researches them first, knows everything about the target's assets, their emotional vulnerabilities, and their social circle before she even introduces herself. He paused, a warning in his voice. Does your son have access to your house, your finances, to your health information? Not yet, I said, a chill running down my spine as I remembered Dennis's notes on property health and dates and times. But she's been setting the stage. Small comments. Then you have time, Mrs. Bennett. Stop her before she gets him to sign anything. She operates on a very tight, predictable timeline. I thanked him and hung up, the receiver trembling against my ear. Tom came in, sat opposite me, his face grave. We didn't need to speak. The truth was laid out on the desk between us, ugly and undeniable. Dennis suspected all of this, Tom said finally, confirming my worst fears. He came to me 6 months before he died, asked me to help him, said he had a buddy, a private investigator, Peter Coleman. They were working together quietly. Why didn't Dennis tell me? The question was less an accusation and more a cry of pain. He said he needed ironclad proof, Carol. Said Brian was so in love, so completely captivated that he'd never believe it otherwise. He knew Vanessa would simply convince Brian that you were jealous, or worse, delusional. Tom reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a clean, crisp business card. Peter Coleman, Private Investigations, former detective. "Peter's been waiting," Tom said, placing the card in my hand. "Dennis made him promise not to contact you directly unless Vanessa made a move against you. Now she is." "Call him." I took the card, feeling the smooth, professional card stock grounding me. But before I could call Peter, I remembered the only other item Dennis had left me. "First," I said, standing up, my mind racing ahead, "I need to go to the bank." First National Bank was across town. I drove there with Dennis's investigation file riding shotgun on the passenger seat, the small wooden box containing the key nestled in my purse. The bank was busy. Friday afternoon. People cashing checks, making deposits. The cheerful, mundane business of ordinary life, utterly oblivious to the quiet war being waged around me. I asked for access to the safe deposit boxes. The manager, a kind woman in her 50s, led me through a heavy steel door and into the vault. Box 447. The key from the little wooden box fit perfectly. Inside was a single envelope, thick and legal-sized. I opened it. Inside were stock certificates in a protective plastic sleeve, accompanying documentation, and another letter from Dennis. I recognized his handwriting immediately, and my eyes welled up again, this time not with pain, but with profound, protective love. The letter read, "My Carol, I bought this stock as a favor to a patient back in '94. His son was starting a tech company and needed investors. I gave him $5,000, never expecting anything in return. The patient died the next year, and honestly, I forgot about these certificates. I found them last month while organizing my old files. I looked up the company and nearly fell over. This is worth more than we ever saved. This is for you, for our future, for security. I put it in the most secure place I know. If you're reading this from the safe deposit box, something happened to me. Sell these when you're ready. Live well, travel, stay independent. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. You're taken care of, Den." I took the certificates back out to the bank manager. "Can you tell me what these are worth today?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She took them back to her computer, typing quickly, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her eyes went wide, then she looked up at me in stunned disbelief. "Mrs. Bennett, this is incredible. TechCore Solutions went public last year. These shares are currently valued at approximately $342,000. I sat down hard in the plush, corporate chair she offered me. I just sat. The world seemed to spin for a moment, the sound of the busy bank receding into a low hum. The manager brought me water. "Are you all right?" "My husband bought these," I managed to say. She confirmed the records. "Purchased May '94 for a mere $5,000. The company remained private for 30 years, then boomed upon going public. $342,000. Dennis didn't just leave me a warning, he left me financial security I never knew existed. He didn't just shield me from a snake, he armed me with a sword. I had resources now. Power. Options. I was no longer the frail, easily manipulated widow Vanessa assumed me to be. I could fight her on equal footing. The following Saturday morning, I met Peter Coleman at a coffee shop near the hospital. Tom had called him, setting up the meeting with minimal drama. Peter was 55, graying at the temples, methodical-looking, a former detective. He was exactly the kind of calm, professional counterforce we needed. He had 2 folders with him and sat across from me in the quiet booth. "Dennis was my friend, Carol," he said, his eyes direct and serious. When I heard about his death, I wondered if Vanessa would make her move, but I kept investigating quietly, just as he asked. "Thank you, Peter. Dennis made me promise not to contact you directly unless Vanessa actively moved against you. He didn't want to alarm you with unproven suspicions. He wanted you to live your life without fear." Peter opened his first folder. It was a file detailing Vanessa's digital footprint from the last 3 months. "She's active on several caregiver forums under a fake name," Peter explained. Posts asking how to convince resistant elderly people they need help. Questions about assisted living facilities, memory care costs, and property browsing history, specifically Costa Rica real estate. She knows the exit strategy. He opened the second folder. This was a financial investigation. Credit cards in Brian's name, Peter stated. 3 different cards, totaling $32,000 in debt. Charges for designer clothes, expensive restaurants, a luxury hotel in Paris. Your son's salary as an office manager is $65,000 a year, Carol. Not enough to support this lifestyle. She's living on borrowed money. Money he doesn't even know he owes yet. Peter laid out the projected timeline based on her previous victims, Stanley and George. Phase 1, the Paris trip. Build the dream. Make Brian feel inadequate yet aspirational. Phase 2, the next 2 to 3 months. She'll start the subtle concerns about you. Suggest you're tired, declining. Phase 3, 4 to 6 months. Build the case for assisted living. Phase 4, 6 to 8 months. Convince Brian to sell your house. Your house is paid off, Peter noted. Valued at about $320,000, exactly. Her total take would be over $350,000. Peter closed the folder. She's in setup phase now. They're getting back from Paris this week. When they return, she'll start the campaign in earnest. Can the police stop her now? I asked, my voice tight. Not yet. She hasn't committed a crime in this state. The previous scams were in Arizona and Florida. Until she actually takes money or commits fraud here, the police can't act. We wait for her to hurt us. I swallowed hard. So we wait for her to hurt us? No, Peter corrected me, leaning forward, his eyes intense. We build the case now. We document everything. When she makes her move, we are ready. And Carol, Brian has to see the truth himself. If you just tell him, she'll convince him you're paranoid. He has to discover it. It has to be his truth. I understood immediately. Brian, my kind, trusting son, wouldn't believe me without proof he found himself. The task was clear, terrifying, and necessary. That evening, the quiet in my house felt vast and heavy. I sat at my old oak kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped Brian with his geometry homework, and where Dennis had read the Sunday paper, now transformed into a command center. I opened my notebook and started making a list. A detailed, chronological account of everything I had noticed about Vanessa over the last 2 years, everything Dennis had clearly suspected. I had to retrace my own memories, stripping away the layers of denial and acceptance I had built around Vanessa's behavior. 2 months ago, Brian, casual yet persistent, asking exactly where I kept the house deed and other important papers. 6 weeks ago, Vanessa taking unnecessary photos of every room during a brief visit, claiming they were inspirational for their own apartment decor. 1 month ago, Brian asking if I had forgotten about lunch plans we never actually made, looking genuinely concerned when I denied it. 3 weeks ago, Vanessa commenting how tired I seemed, suggesting I must be working too hard or not sleeping well. 2 weeks ago, the subtle but deliberate action of a brochure for Sunset Hills Senior Living falling conspicuously from Vanessa's purse as she stood near the coat rack. The pattern was sharp, undeniable, and utterly predatory. Vanessa wasn't just my son's wife. She was an architect of decline, preparing Brian to believe the narrative that his mother was losing her grip and needed to be institutionalized and stripped of her assets. I thought about the stock certificates, the $342,000 tucked away in the fireproof security of the bank vault. And then I thought about the car, the dark, hidden space in the Shelby where Dennis kept the investigation file. The answer, once I let myself see it, was obvious and heartbreaking. The bank was the safest place for money. The car was the safest place for a secret. Vanessa never went in the garage. She never showed interest in Dennis's tools, his work, or his projects. She stayed in the house, in the polished domestic space she was focused on dominating. The car was Dennis's private space, a sanctuary where he could hide the single most dangerous piece of evidence he possessed. He thought of everything. He planned for his own absence. I closed my notebook, the leather cool beneath my fingers. Outside, the spring evening was warm and quiet, the scent of blooming jasmine heavy in the air. Dennis had protected me in every way possible. He left me money, he left me evidence, and he left me loyal people who would help. Now it was my turn. Now I had to protect Brian. They came back from Paris on a Tuesday. I watched them pull into the driveway, the sight of them together a stark reminder of the danger lurking beneath the surface of their perfect life. Both were deeply tanned, but Brian looked tired, the vacation failing to erase the stress lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. I had invited them for dinner. I knew I had to play the part of the unsuspecting, slightly vulnerable mother perfectly. I made pot roast, Dennis's favorite, and Brian's childhood comfort food. They arrived at 6. Vanessa wore clothes I had never seen before, a silk blouse, designer jeans, and an expensive leather bag casually slung over her shoulder. Every piece screamed quiet, aspirational wealth. I hugged Brian at the door. He held on a second longer than usual, a subtle weight in his embrace that felt more like silent anxiety than affection. Vanessa's hug was quick, performative, her attention already focused past me and into the house. We sat at the kitchen table, the same well-worn oak table where I had raised Brian, the same chairs Dennis refinished 2 decades ago. Vanessa immediately controlled the conversation. Paris was breathtaking. The hotel in the Marais was stunning. They had lunch near the Louvre, dinner at a restaurant whose name I couldn't pronounce. She painted a vivid picture of the life they deserved, the life they should have. It was wonderful, Vanessa sighed, tilting her head toward Brian with a look of manufactured pity. But honestly, it just made me realize how much we're missing out on. Brian works so hard, Carol, and we have so little to show for it. She looked pointedly at me when she said it, the meaning sharp and clear. Your comfortable, paid-off life is what we need to complete our dream. I kept my face neutral, passing the bowl of roasted potatoes. Brian, catching the cue, quickly jumped in. Mom, you should think about traveling too, seeing things, you deserve it. Maybe someday, I said vaguely. Vanessa leaned forward, her smile pleasant, but her eyes hard and focused. Carol, this house, it's really too big for one person, isn't it? Have you thought about downsizing? Maybe something a little more manageable. There it was, the first direct move. Phase 2, the escalation. I'm managing fine, I replied calmly, placing my fork down. And this is my home, of course. Vanessa's smile didn't waver. It was smooth, reasonable, and utterly disarming. We just care about your safety, Carol. The stairs, the yard work. It's a lot for someone your age, dear. Brian nodded along, a loyal echo. We worry about you here alone, Mom. It's too much. I noticed the subtle but critical pronoun change. He said we, not I. Vanessa's words were already coming out of his mouth. I appreciate the concern, I said, maintaining a gentle but firm tone. But I'm fine. Vanessa let it drop, pulling back gracefully, but I saw the calculation in her eyes. The seed was planted. She knew she would push harder next time. After dinner, we moved to the living room for coffee and the apple pie I'd made. About 20 minutes later, Vanessa excused herself. Bathroom down the hall, she announced brightly. She was gone for 10 minutes. I waited 5 more, then excused myself, walking quickly and quietly to the stairs. I found her upstairs, near the door of Dennis's old home office. The downstairs bathroom door was open and empty behind her. She jumped when she saw me, her perfect composure momentarily broken. Oh, Carol. I got turned around. This house has so many rooms. The bathroom is downstairs, Vanessa, I said, my voice utterly devoid of emotion. Where it's always been. She laughed, a quick, nervous sound, and touched my arm, recovering instantly. Of course, silly me, too much wine with dinner. I led her back downstairs, saying nothing more, letting the cold reality of being caught hang in the air between us. She was hunting. She wasn't looking for a bathroom. She was looking for bank statements, deeds, or anything else of value that Dennis might have left behind. They left an hour later. Vanessa was all smiles again. Take care of yourself, Carol. We'll visit again soon. Brian hugged me goodbye, the tight, worried hold returning. Love you, Mom. I watched them drive away, then went straight back to my notebook. I wrote down every detail, every minute while it was fresh. Wednesday morning, I called Brian. "I need to talk to you about something important," I said. "Can you come by this afternoon? Just you." There was a pause on the other end, laced with apprehension. "What's it about, Mom?" "Your father. Something I found in his things, something personal." The silence stretched. I knew what he was considering. "Vanessa and I don't keep secrets, Mom. This is between you and me, Brian. It has to be, please." A long, fraught pause. "Okay," he finally conceded. "This afternoon, I have to tell Vanessa where I'm going, though." "That's fine." He arrived at 3 alone, just as he'd promised. But he looked nervous, defensive, like a soldier walking into an unknown battleground. I had coffee ready. Dennis's investigation file was laid out on the kitchen table, the manila folder a stark contrast to the cheerful tablecloth. Brian saw it immediately, and his shoulders went tight. "Mom, if this is about the car again, or something petty about Dad and Vanessa." "Sit down, please," I interrupted him gently, cutting off the denial before it began. He sat, his arms crossed over his chest, immediately defensive. I took a deep breath, accessing the calm, authoritative voice I used in the ICU during a crisis. It had to be factual, firm, and unwavering. "Before I show you anything, Brian, I need you to listen. Really listen without jumping to conclusions. Can you do that for your father?" "This feels like an ambush," he muttered. "It's protection," I countered softly. I showed him Dennis's letter first, the short, heartfelt plea, "Protect our son." I placed the paper directly into his hands. Brian read it, the color draining from his face as he processed the words. Dad was investigating Vanessa for 18 months before he died. His reaction was instantaneous, loud, and angry. "This is ridiculous. Dad never liked her." "He was paranoid about everything, Mom. He told me she was after his car. This is just a joke." "Look at the evidence, Brian," I insisted, my voice remaining calm despite the tremor in my chest. I spread the photographs on the table, Vanessa at 2 different weddings with 2 different men. Beside them, the marriage certificates. Vanessa Cortland married Stanley Wright. Vanessa Cortland married George Murphy. Brian stared at them. "This could be anyone, someone with the same name." "Call them," I challenged him. "Ask them about their wives." I handed him the piece of paper Dennis had carefully prepared, the phone numbers written in my husband's careful handwriting. "They are not random. They were married to your wife before you. You want me to call random strangers?" He asked, his voice escalating into a shout. "They are not random. Call them. Prove me wrong. Prove your father wrong." He grabbed the paper, crumpling it tightly in his fist. He stood up, started pacing, his denial giving way to confusion and fear. "This is insane." "Vanessa wouldn't do this. She loves me." "Then prove me wrong," I repeated, my voice now quiet and steady. "Call them." He headed for the door, unable to handle the confrontation. "I'm not doing this." "Brian, please." He turned, tears of frustration and confusion welling in his eyes. "Why are you doing this, Mom? Can't you just let me be happy?" My own voice broke then, the hard shell of the ICU nurse fracturing. "Because your father died trying to protect you. And I am not going to let his last months be for nothing." Brian slammed the door behind him and peeled out of the driveway, the screech of his tires a sharp, painful sound. I didn't know if he would call those numbers or if he would go straight to Vanessa. Either way, the choice was his now. All I could do was wait. The waiting, I realized, was the worst part of all. I sat at the kitchen table long after Brian left, staring at the crumpled piece of paper that held the names of Stanley and George, the ghost husbands. I couldn't eat. I couldn't focus on anything. The house, usually a comfort, felt like a cage. The silence was deafening, magnified by the fear that I had pushed Brian too hard, that the anger and denial would win out, and he would run straight back to Vanessa, giving her all the tools she needed to discredit me completely. The clock on the wall ticked agonizingly slow. Every shadow seemed to shift, every creak of the old house sounded like a threat. At 8 o'clock, Peter Coleman called. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice low and professional, used to handling explosive situations. "He was angry," I admitted, my voice strained. "He denied everything." He left the house furious. I don't know what he'll do now. He took the phone numbers, but he crumpled the paper. Give him time, Carol, Peter advised. The truth has to sink in. She's built a formidable psychological fortress around him. But Dennis's death, the file, and those names, they are the first cracks. He's going to spend the next few hours trying to convince himself that you're wrong. But time felt like a precious commodity, running out minute by minute. If Brian told Vanessa, she would immediately orchestrate an escape, liquidate any joint assets, and vanish, perhaps forever. I tried to read, tried to watch television, but the words and images blurred. I made a cup of tea, but it grew cold on the counter. The only thing I could do was wait for the sound of the phone ringing. Midnight finally arrived, turning Wednesday into Thursday. The house was pitch dark save for the small lamp on the kitchen counter. I was just deciding whether to give up and try to sleep when the phone rang. The sound sliced through the silence like a knife. I snatched it up. Brian's name was on the screen. Brian! His voice was a wreck, raw, thick, and broken. Mom. I called them both. I heard the sound of heavy, choked sobs on the other end. My heart broke, not because I was right, but because he was finally, painfully facing the truth. What did they say, honey? Everything, he whispered, the sound dissolving into renewed tears. Stanley's mother, George's father's shop, the house, the selling, the disappearing, it's the same. Exactly the same story, down to the details of the joint account and the time frame. I closed my eyes, a silent prayer of thanks to Dennis escaping my lips. I'm so sorry, Brian. I went home after I left your house, he continued, his voice shaking with a mixture of shame and disbelief. I was so angry at you. I told myself Dad was jealous, but I kept thinking about those marriage certificates. I kept thinking about Dad's journal entries about his work. So you decided to test her? I decided to test her, he confirmed. I just asked simple questions, like where she grew up. What her maiden name was, tell me about your family. He took a shaky, deep breath, the sound of his grief palpable. Her answers were different, not just a little different, completely different from things she told me before. Different town, different college, different everything. The moment the lie had to be defended, the truth began to unravel. What did you do next? I pushed, he said, the adrenaline starting to creep into his voice, making it flat and hard. I asked about the credit cards. The ones in my name that I didn't know about. I told her I saw a statement that the debt was too high for us. He paused, the memory clearly horrific. Her whole face changed, Mom, like a mask came off. The kindness, the softness, it all vanished. She said they were business investments that I wouldn't understand. She said I should trust my wife. But you didn't. No, I kept pushing. I said I wanted to see the statements. That they're in my name and I deserve to know where $32,000 went. She packed a bag right then, no more pretending. She looked at me with absolute contempt and said I was weak. She said I was just like what your dad said, just like all of them. His voice broke completely. She walked out. Just got in her car and left. She called me pathetic, Mom. Stay there, I commanded, the ICU nurse voice snapping back into focus. Don't move, don't call her. I'm calling Peter Coleman right now. I hung up and immediately dialed Peter. He answered on the first ring, clearly having been monitoring the situation. She's running, Peter said, cutting straight to the chase. I'm already tracking her through the credit cards. She checked into the airport Marriott an hour ago. She made multiple large cash withdrawals over the last 2 hours. Got about $12,000 total. My stomach dropped. She's leaving the country. She just booked a flight, Mexico City, 6 a.m. departure, one way. She's running with Brian's money. Yes, but I found something else while waiting for your call, Peter stated, his voice gaining urgency. Vanessa Cortland is a stolen identity. The real Vanessa Cortland died in a car accident in 2018. This woman's real name is Linda Marsh. She's wanted for fraud in 2 other states under different names. Can the police stop her now? I've been in contact with detectives in Arizona and Florida. They will issue a warrant based on her outstanding charges and the evidence Dennis collected. If we move now, we can get her at the airport before she boards that plane. This is our window, Carol. What do you need? Brian's cooperation. His statement about the forged credit card fraud, that he didn't authorize them. Can he do that now that he knows? Yes, I said with absolute certainty. He will. At 3 o'clock in the morning, we met at my house. Peter arrived first, grim-faced but methodical. Brian pulled up moments later, looking utterly destroyed. His eyes were red, shadowed, and haunted. He hadn't slept, and the shock had clearly left him numb. He sat at the kitchen table, the light harsh and unforgiving, while Peter laid out the final plan. Vanessa, or Linda Marsh, is leaving on a 6:00 a.m. flight. The police are ready to arrest her on outstanding warrants, but we need your statement, Brian, about the forged credit cards. That's the local charge that will hold her here. Peter looked directly at my son. This means it gets public. You'll have to testify about the fraud, your relationship, and the fact that you were targeted. Are you ready for that? Brian looked at me, his eyes searching for guidance in the terrible maze of his new reality. What would Dad do? The question cut through me. I reached out and covered his trembling hand with mine. Your father spent his last months building a case against her, I said softly, tears pricking my eyes. He died before he could finish it. He'd want you to stop her, Brian, not for revenge. But so she doesn't do this to Stanley, or George, or some other trusting man ever again. He wanted you to protect the family. Brian was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the scars on the old wooden table. Then he nodded, his jaw setting with a new, quiet strength. Call the police, he said. Let's go to the airport. We got into Peter's dark, unmarked car, driving through the empty streets. It was 4 a.m, the city dark except for the intermittent glow of the streetlights. Brian sat in the back seat, staring straight ahead at nothing, processing the collapse of his entire world. I reached back and took his hand, and he held on tight, seeking the only safe anchor left in his life. The airport was just waking up when we arrived. Coffee shops were opening, the fluorescent lights harsh overhead, business travelers pulling luggage, looking tired and rushed. The perfect setting for a final, frantic escape. We stood behind a large pillar near the security checkpoint. Peter positioned us where we could see, but remain obscured. 2 plainclothes detectives were already there, blending seamlessly into the morning crowd. Brian hadn't spoken since we got in the car, just stared at the boarding monitor. I stayed close to him, my presence a silent shield. 5:30 a.m. the security line started filling up. Then Vanessa appeared. 2 large, expensive suitcases, a designer coat, sunglasses despite the early hour, and her hair perfectly styled. She looked like someone heading for a relaxing week in the sun, calm, confident, utterly oblivious to the net closing around her. She held her phone in one hand and her boarding pass in the other. She got in the security line, pulling her luggage forward. The detectives moved, subtle, professional, and swift. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you," one detective said, stepping into her path. Vanessa turned, saw them, and for just a second the mask slipped. The confidence faltered. Then she smiled, a practiced, flawless gesture. "Is there a problem, officers?" The detective showed his badge. "We have a warrant for your arrest, Linda Marsh." Vanessa's smile froze solid. "I don't know who that is," she stated firmly. "My name is Vanessa Bennett. Ma'am, please step aside." Vanessa looked around, calculating her odds. She saw the other detective blocking the exit path. In a terrifying, desperate flash of instinct, she dropped her luggage, kicked off her expensive high heels, and ran. Barefoot in her stockings, she sprinted across the polished terminal floor toward the departure board. Airport security caught her before she made it 20 feet. A guard tackled her, bringing her down hard near the check-in kiosks. She fought back, kicking, screaming, "Get off me, I haven't done anything." People stopped, watched, and pulled out their phones. The police handcuffed her right there on the floor, reading her rights while she thrashed. A detective opened her abandoned luggage right at the security checkpoint. Inside the first suitcase were clothes and toiletries. Inside the second were stacks of cash, rubber-banded and sorted. The detective later told us it was $48,000 total. Along with the cash, there was a passport with her photo, but a different name, Linda Brennan, and documents detailing multiple bank account numbers and an external hard drive. The detective held up the passport. "Want to explain this, ma'am?" Vanessa spat at him. They lifted her to her feet, her composure completely shattered. She was still fighting the officers when she saw us. She saw Brian standing 30 feet away, and me right beside him. She went completely still. Then her face transformed, contorting into pure, venomous rage. "You!" She screamed, lunging toward him until the police held her back. "You did this." Vanessa's rage was a shocking, tangible force. It was the moment the beautiful, charming facade cracked completely, revealing the predator underneath. She lunged, held back only by the firm grip of the police officers. "You're pathetic," she screamed at Brian, her voice raw, echoing through the vast, suddenly silent terminal. "Weak, stupid, just like the others. You really thought someone like me would want you. You're nothing, nothing." Brian flinched, reeling from the sudden, hateful verbal assault. He was staring at the woman who had pretended to love him, who had planned their life together, now discarding him like trash. I stepped in front of Brian. Not much, just enough. I positioned myself between her and my son, my stance protective, defiant. Vanessa's fury instantly turned on me. "And you interfering old woman, this was mine, my score. 3 years I spent on this, building him up. You should have minded your own business and died already." Her voice was high and shrill, the insults ringing through the terminal. People were staring, recording on their phones, witnessing the spectacular collapse of a carefully constructed lie. I didn't react. I just stood there, the calm eye of the storm, my hand remaining firmly on Brian's arm. The police dragged Vanessa away, her struggling body a violent, pathetic contrast to her earlier designer elegance. She was still screaming threats and obscenities, her voice fading rapidly as they took her through the security doors toward the holding area. Then she was gone. The airport slowly returned to its hum of early morning business. Brian stood frozen, shaking, his face pale and slack with shock. The venom of her final words had pierced deeper than any bullet. "Let's go home, honey," I whispered, gently guiding him away from the scene. Peter walked us back to his car. The ride home was silent, heavy, and exhausting. Brian didn't hold my hand this time. He simply sat rigid, staring out the window at the morning light that was finally starting to break over the city. 2 weeks later, the chaos had subsided into grim, professional reality. We were at the police station, giving formal statements to Detective Ramirez, a sharp, empathetic woman in the fraud division who had been working with Peter. Detective Ramirez explained everything they had found. Vanessa's real name was Linda Marsh, born in Ohio. She started running small-scale cons at 20, quickly graduating to identity theft and elder fraud. The woman named Vanessa Cortland was a stolen identity, a victim of a fatal car accident in 2018, whose records Linda Marsh had meticulously appropriated and used for the last 6 years. "We've found 5 previous victims so far," Detective Ramirez explained. 2 before Stanley Wright. The pattern goes back 8 years. The charges filed in 3 states, Arizona, Florida, and here, include identity theft, fraud, theft by deception, and forgery. The prosecutor expected a plea deal. The evidence was overwhelming, thanks primarily to the meticulous file Dennis had kept. "We're looking at 12 to 15 years in federal prison," the detective concluded. "The scale and duration of the fraud will ensure a serious sentence." Stanley Wright's and George Murphy's cases were being reopened with the new evidence. They might be able to recover some funds through civil suits now that the identity of the culprit was confirmed and her assets seized. Brian's credit card debt, mostly forgiven. The banks approved the fraud claims quickly once the police provided the evidence of the identity theft and unauthorized charges. A month later, Brian showed up at my door with 2 battered suitcases. "Can I stay here, Mom?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Just for a while, I can't go back to the apartment." "Of course, honey," I said, stepping aside immediately. "This is your home." "Come in." He took his old room upstairs, the same room from high school, the faded football posters still on the walls, the dusty trophies on the shelf. The comfort of the familiar past was a necessary balm against the shock of his recent present. The divorce was granted, though technically it was an annulment. The marriage was never legally valid, as Vanessa had married him under a stolen identity. Brian started therapy, twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Some days he seemed okay. He'd make breakfast, help around the house, and even manage a strained smile. Other days he barely spoke, stayed in his room, coming out only for meals. I didn't push. Years as an ICU nurse taught me about trauma and healing. It is not linear. It is messy. It takes time. You simply hold the space and keep the patient safe until they can start fighting again. I made his favorite foods, left lights on, and kept the coffee ready. 2 months after the airport confrontation, the prosecutor called with the final news. Vanessa/Linda Marsh had taken the plea deal. 12 years in federal prison. I told Brian over dinner. He just nodded, his face blank. Didn't say anything, didn't react. That Saturday, I found him in the garage. He was sitting on Dennis's old work stool, the steel cold and familiar, holding the burgundy leather work journal. Tears were running freely down his face, silent and heavy. I stood in the doorway, letting the scent of motor oil and sawdust wash over me, the familiar scent of Dennis. I waited. I found this on the workbench, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I started reading it. He opened to a page from years ago, Dennis's strong, precise handwriting filling the page. Taught Brian to change the oil today. He's 12, old enough to learn. His hands are still small but careful. He listened to every word, so proud of him. Brian's hands, now scarred and calloused from his own adult life, shook as he held the page. He flipped to another entry, written much later, closer to his college years. Brian came by to help with the engine rebuild this weekend. We worked all afternoon, elbow to elbow, barely talked. Didn't need to. These are the days I'll remember. I barely remember this, Brian whispered, his voice broken. Working on the car with him, I was so young. I didn't appreciate it. I sat on the edge of the workbench beside him. He loved those days, honey. He talked about them all the time. He didn't forget a single moment. The shame finally flooded him. I sold his car, he choked out, the reality hitting him with full force. The car he spent 20 years on. I sold it for $15,000 just for a trip to impress a woman who was planning to destroy our family. You didn't know, I said gently. I should have known, he insisted, wiping his eyes roughly with his sleeve. Dad tried to warn me. Those last few months he kept asking about Vanessa, about our plans, about money. I thought he was being controlling. I thought he was trying to sabotage my life. He stopped, his head bowed. The last conversation I had with him, Mom, we argued about her. I told him to back off, to let me live my life. He died a week later. I never apologized. My throat was tight with sympathetic pain, but I knew I had to give him the final piece of the puzzle, the true absolution. He knew you loved him, Brian. He shook his head, the denial deeply ingrained. How could he? I chose her over him, over you. Over everything he taught me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the final letter, the one Dennis had left in the car. The one about needing ironclad proof before telling Brian. Read this, I commanded, placing it in his trembling hands. Brian read Dennis's words about not wanting to break his son's heart without absolute proof, about loving him unconditionally, about Brian being a victim, too, manipulated by a professional. He understood, I said, putting my arm around his shoulders. He knew Vanessa was good at what she did. He didn't blame you, Brian. Never. Brian finally broke down completely. Deep sobs shook his whole body, releasing months of grief, denial, and crushing guilt. I held him all those years of being a mother, holding my son through scraped knees, disappointments, and heartbreaks. This one cut the deepest, but it was also the moment he truly started to heal. We sat in the garage for a long time, surrounded by Dennis's tools, his workbench, his old radio, the smell of motor oil and old leather a comforting blanket around us. Eventually, Brian's tears stopped. He wiped his face with his sleeve, leaving streaks of grime and tears. I wish the car was still here, he said, his voice raw and thick. I'd learn everything about it, the way Dad wanted me to. I didn't say anything, just squeezed his shoulder. He carefully closed the work journal, placing it back on the workbench exactly where Dennis had left it. We walked back to the house. Evening was coming on, spring turning to summer. The air was warm and thick with anticipation. Inside, I started making dinner. Brian, without being asked, began setting the table. The house felt different, not empty anymore. Not quite whole yet either, but healing slowly, purposefully. I paid off Brian's remaining debt the week after Vanessa was sentenced. The $5,000 the fraud claims didn't cover. I simply wrote the check and didn't mention it again. The stock certificates from Dennis gave me choices I never expected. The $342,000 was more money than we'd saved in our entire marriage. I thought about what to do with it. Stanley Wright, whose mother died heartbroken in a memory care facility she never needed. George Murphy, whose father's shop, 40 years of work, was gone. I sent them each a check for $10,000. I attached a brief note to Stanley, for your mother's memory, from someone who understands. A similar note went to George. For myself, I decided to stay in the house. Maybe travel a little, small trips, nothing fancy. Stay independent just as Dennis wanted. 2 months after the airport, on a Saturday morning, I heard an engine rumble outside. Deep, powerful, familiar. The sound of the engine was distinct. A deep, throaty rumble that vibrated through the floorboards, the unmistakable sound of a high-performance American V8. My chest went tight, an involuntary physical reaction to the memory it instantly conjured. It couldn't be. I walked toward the kitchen window, my heart hammering against my ribs. Parked in my driveway, gleaming burgundy in the morning sun, sat the Shelby Cobra. It looked flawless. Every curve, every chrome detail, every inch of the deep red paint reflected the light with the impossible perfection Dennis had always maintained. Tom Graves was behind the wheel. I heard Brian's door open upstairs. His footsteps hurried on the landing, then on the stairs. He'd heard it too. He knew that sound better than his own name. We both walked out onto the front porch, stopping side by side, unable to move past the sight of the car. Tom got out, his face creased in a genuine, happy smile when he saw us. "Bringing her home where she belongs," he announced, his voice warm with satisfaction. Brian stared at the car. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. The sight of the Shelby, the painful, undeniable symbol of the legacy he had tossed away, held him captive. Tom walked toward us, pulling the heavy car keys from his pocket. He held them out, not toward Brian, but toward me. "This was never mine, Carol," Tom said, his eyes unwavering. "Dennis built it for you and for the family." He wanted Brian to understand the mechanics, yes, but he built it as a symbol of permanence and dedication. I tried to find a way to get it back the day Brian sold it, but it was too fast. It took time, patience, and a little bit of searching. I tried to find words, but my throat closed up. "Tom, you paid Brian $15,000 for that sale. That was your money." Tom shook his head. "I know, but this car is worth more than money, Carol. It's a connection. Dennis would want you to have it. He'd want Brian to learn it. That's what matters to the man, not the cash, but the continuity." Brian finally found his voice, a raw, painful rasp. "I sold it, Tom. I threw it away. I traded 20 years of my father's life for a luxury hotel stay." Tom looked directly at him, his gaze firm but compassionate. "You were a victim, Brian. Your dad knew that better than anyone. That's why he built the case to protect you. Don't let her poison the memory of your relationship with your father. That car is proof of his love." Tom held the keys out to me again. "Dennis told me once that this car was never really his. It was always meant for his family, for the people he loved. He wanted the best for you both." I reached out and took the keys. They were heavy, cold, and immensely powerful in my hand. Tom gestured toward the garage. "You want help backing her in?" We opened the garage door together. The space looked bare, empty of its purpose for months. Tom backed the Shelby into its spot, the same spot it had left months ago. The faint, dark oil stain on the concrete where Dennis usually worked was still there. The engine shut off. Silence settled. Then the garage smelled like it should again. Motor oil, old leather, Dennis. Tom got out, standing beside me and Brian, looking at the car for a long moment. He didn't speak about the car itself, but about the mission. "He'd be proud of what you did, Carol," Tom said to me, laying a hand briefly on my shoulder. "Stopping her. Protecting your son, finishing what he started." He looked at Brian, his expression warm. "And he'd be proud of you too, son. Proud that you faced the truth and fought back." The return of the Shelby was the turning point. It wasn't just a car. It was the final, tangible piece of Dennis's protective armor wrapping around us. Brian didn't touch it immediately. For a week, he would stand in the garage doorway just looking at it. He'd open the hood and stare at the engine, a masterpiece of chrome and wiring, then quickly close it, overwhelmed by the memory and the weight of his own regret. I knew the technical aspect of the car was Brian's way back to his father. I didn't push, but I gave him the tool he needed. I walked into the garage that Saturday, carrying a copy of Dennis's thick, grease-stained repair manual. "Your father taught me to be resourceful, Brian," I said, placing the book on the workbench beside the journal. "He always said that a nurse and a mechanic work with the same principles: methodical investigation, precise movements, and relentless focus on the system that keeps the patient, or the engine, alive." Brian smiled faintly, the first genuine smile I had seen in weeks. "I never thought of it that way." "You lost the emotional attachment, but you didn't lose the skill set. Dennis wanted you to have the patience for the long work." I tapped the manual. "It's all in here. Every wire, every torque specification, every modification he made. He built it, now you learn how to maintain it. It's the highest form of respect for his work." That was the permission he needed. That evening, Brian was back in the garage, wearing Dennis's old coveralls. He opened the hood, pulled out the work light, and began to read the manual. He started small. First, he spent hours just cleaning and detailing the engine bay, removing the accumulated dust of the last months. Then, he moved on to fluids. He spent an entire Sunday changing the oil, referencing Dennis's journal entry from when he was 12. "He taught me the importance of the filter," Brian muttered to me one evening, looking up from under the car. "Said it was like the kidneys of the engine. Get it wrong, and the whole system fails." It wasn't just working on the car, it was therapy. It was a silent, mechanical conversation with his deceased father. The physical labor grounded him, and the methodical nature of the work calmed the chaos in his mind. My own life shifted from crisis mode to rebuilding. With the $342,000 security blanket Dennis left me, I had freedom. I went to a financial planner, a kind woman Tom recommended. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, looking over my assets, "you have far more financial security than most people your age. Your pension, your paid-off house, and this substantial stock holding means you can easily maintain your independence." That word, independence, echoed Dennis's final note. I decided to make an international move. Not a trip, but a serious gesture of closure and aid. The $10,000 checks I sent to Stanley Wright and George Murphy were not an attempt to repay their losses, but a gesture of apology and solidarity from a fellow victim. Stanley called me a week after receiving the check. His voice was lighter, less burdened. "Carol, you didn't have to do this," he said. "Yes, I did, Stanley. Dennis considered you both victims, and so do I. That money is for your mother. Perhaps you can use it to establish a scholarship or donate it to the community center where you met her. Just know it comes with deep respect." I think I will do that," he promised. "Thank you. This whole thing feels less heavy now, like a chapter is finally closed." George Murphy, the man who lost his father's shop, sent me a card. Inside, he wrote, "For 40 years, my father built that shop on integrity. When Vanessa took the money, she took the proof of that integrity. This $10,000, Carol, means my father's work wasn't for nothing. I'm going to put it towards starting a youth mechanics program at the local high school, keeping the knowledge going. Thank you for protecting your son and for finishing Dennis's work." Reading that card, I finally understood the true weight of what Dennis had done. He didn't just save our money, he saved our connection to the values we cherished. Brian's annulment went through without issue. Legally, the marriage never happened, erasing Vanessa from his permanent record. But the emotional scars were real, and they ran deep. One Tuesday, after his therapy session, Brian came home and sat with me in the living room. "Dr. Chen asked me today what I was grateful for," he said quietly, picking at a loose thread on the sofa. "And what did you tell him?" I told him. I was grateful for two things: that Dad loved me enough to suspect the worst, and that you loved me enough to believe him. I felt the familiar burning behind my eyes, but I held the tears back. "Your father never doubted your heart, Brian. Just your judgment for a short while, but your heart was always pure. I owe you everything, Mom. You owe me nothing, Brian. You owe yourself healing. And you owe your father the honor of moving forward. He didn't save us just to see us grieve forever." He nodded, leaning his head against the back of the sofa, finally looking tired in a good, honest way. "I need to sell my apartment," he said. "Get rid of everything from that life. I want to save up and buy a small house, but I need to start over, completely clean." "Good," I said. "Start clean." The future felt vast and uncertain, but no longer dark. We were in a holding pattern, but the trajectory was now upward. The cancer had been removed, and the long, slow work of recovery had begun. The garage was no longer a place of sorrow, but a place of industrious, mechanical hope. Every Saturday, the deep rumble of the Shelby's V8 filled the driveway, a sound that no longer brought tears, but a sense of profound, protective peace. The Shelby became the center of Brian's recovery. It was a physical manifestation of his relationship with his father, a constant, tangible presence that defied Vanessa's attempt to erase their family history. Brian had inherited his father's methodical approach, dedicating himself to the car's upkeep with the same precision he'd once seen Dennis employ. He spent his evenings in the garage, not just working, but learning the history of the build. He learned that the frame was custom welded, the leather seats were hand-stitched by an artisan Dennis knew from a car show, and the engine, a rebuilt V8, had been calibrated over a span of 5 years. One afternoon, I brought him a sandwich and found him staring intently at the dashboard. "Dad did this," Brian said, not looking up. "He knew I always complained about having too many gauges in my old truck. He said a good engine needs to tell you its story. Look at the oil pressure, the water temperature, the voltage. It's all a narrative." "He was a storyteller through his hands," I confirmed, setting the sandwich down. "And he told Tom," Brian continued, rubbing a finger over the smooth, cold chrome of a toggle switch, "that he added the secret compartment years ago, not for money, but just in case. Just in case someone ever tried to take the real things, the family secrets, the truth." The fact that Dennis had suspected the possibility of betrayal and had prepared for it so long ago was profoundly comforting. It absolved Brian of the feeling that his father's actions were a sudden, desperate reaction to Vanessa. Dennis had simply been prudent, protecting his assets, both material and emotional, for decades. Brian finally sold his apartment. He got a decent price, but the move was painful, packing up the life he thought was real, discarding the expensive, tasteless furnishings Vanessa had insisted upon. When he came home that evening, he was exhausted. "It's gone, Mom," he announced, sinking onto the living room couch. "The key is turned over. Everything she touched is out of my life." "Good," I said, handing him a mug of coffee. "Now we focus on the future." "I want to get a place nearby," he mused. "Something small where I can walk to work and save money, but I don't think I can handle a mortgage right now. The pressure of debt." "I have an idea about that," I interrupted, smiling slightly. "Remember those stock certificates your father left me? The $342,000. Brian looked uncomfortable. "Mom, that's your retirement. I don't want you to—" "Listen," I said gently. "Dennis left me more than money. He left me options. He left me independence. I don't need to touch the principal of that fund to live comfortably for the rest of my life. But you need more than a house. You need a fresh start, one without the shadow of debt or the need to impress anyone." I pulled out a prepared envelope. "I talked to the financial planner. We're setting aside a small, separate account. This isn't a gift, Brian. It's an investment in your future, paid for by the diligence of your father. It's enough for a very substantial down payment, perhaps even enough to buy a small starter home outright, depending on the market. Brian opened the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $100,000. His eyes filled up, not with grief, but with profound gratitude. Mom, I can't. Yes, you can. You take it, and you build a safe, honest life. That's the only return your father and I want on that investment. You don't have to worry about a huge mortgage or interest. You just worry about rebuilding your happiness. He came around the couch and hugged me tightly, the embrace strong and sure. It was a hug from a man who had been shattered and was now starting to put himself back together. My own life began to expand. I continued my work at the ICU, finding renewed satisfaction in the precise, demanding environment. But with my financial worries erased, I started exploring the idea of travel. I looked at the brochures, small trips, independent tour, nothing flashy or demanding. I booked a 2-week tour of the historical gardens and architecture of coastal England. I didn't need a companion. Dennis had insisted I stay independent, and I was going to honor that. I called Tom to tell him my plans. England? That's wonderful, Carol. Dennis would love that for you. I'm nervous about leaving the house empty, though, I admitted. And Brian is finally settled in his routine with the car and his therapy. Don't worry about a thing, Tom assured me. The car and the house are under my jurisdiction while you're gone. I'll make sure the Shelby is started every few days, and I'll keep an eye on Brian. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Dennis saved my life 40 years ago when I almost took a header off a scaffolding. I owe him everything. Taking care of his family is my way of paying that back. Tom was truly the definition of loyalty. He and Dennis had a bond forged in shared labor and mutual respect, a kind of relationship that seemed rare now. I was so grateful Dennis had built a network of protection for us that extended far beyond his lifetime. A week before my trip, I had a long, detailed meeting with Peter Coleman. He brought me up to date on Vanessa's legal situation. She's fighting the extradition to Arizona and Florida, but it's a losing battle, Peter said, sitting in my sunlit living room. She's trying to minimize her exposure, claiming she was a victim of coercion in the earlier cons, but the evidence is overwhelming. She'll spend at least a decade in federal custody, possibly more if the other states prosecute consecutively. And Stanley and George, will they recover anything? There's a good chance. The $48,000 cash seized at the airport, plus some frozen assets and her designer goods, will go into a restitution fund. It won't cover their full losses, but it will be a substantial return. Peter leaned forward. I wanted to give you something else. A piece of closure that Brian should see. He handed me a large, glossy printout. It was a photograph taken by a surveillance camera at the airport. It wasn't the arrest itself, but a picture taken moments after she was dragged away. It was a photo of Brian and me. Brian was standing slightly behind me, my hand still on his arm. We were silhouetted against the bright terminal lights, and in the foreground, you could see the discarded designer coat and the high heels. We looked small but utterly unified, facing the chaos that had just exploded around us. It shows everything, Peter said quietly. The attack, the aftermath, but mostly it shows that she failed to divide you. Dennis won, Carol, because you both faced it together. I tucked the photo away, a quiet testament to our survival. Brian found a small, charming cottage near the local university. It was old but structurally sound and had a small, single-car garage. The closing was quick and drama-free. When he got the keys, he stood in the empty living room, the wood floors reflecting the afternoon light. It feels real, he said, turning to me, his voice thick with emotion. It's mine. I paid cash for it. No one else has a claim. It's a safe space, Brian. That's what matters. The first thing I'm going to do is install a workbench in the garage, and I'm going to start driving the Shelby. The next morning, before the closing, Brian drove the Shelby from my house to his new cottage. It was the first time he had driven it since it returned. I watched him pull out of the driveway, the engines growl confident and strong. He drove slowly, carefully, respecting the car's power and history. When he returned on foot an hour later, he was beaming. "It feels perfect," he announced. "The shifting is a little tight, but Dad kept that engine tuned beautifully. I took it down the coast highway. It felt like Dad was riding beside me. He was, I promised him. He always will be." Brian's healing was tangible now. He had a home, a project, and a clear path forward. The guilt was receding, replaced by a fierce determination to live up to the legacy of his father's faith. My English trip was approaching. I felt a surge of nervous excitement. It wasn't just a vacation. It was the first step into my independent future, a life lived entirely on my own terms. I spent the final days before my trip organizing Dennis's things. I had left his home office untouched for months, but now I felt strong enough to face it. I opened his desk drawers, files, patient records, and old medical journals. Then, tucked into the back corner of the bottom drawer, I found a small, worn piece of paper, a shopping list. It was dated 3 days before he died. Bread, milk, tomatoes. And at the very bottom, scrawled in a darker ink, "Call Tom. Install second lock on file cabinet." The tears came soft and quiet this time. He was planning his final security measures right up until the end. His last thoughts weren't about death, but about protection. I folded the note, placing it in my purse. I was ready to leave. I was ready to live. My trip to England was restorative, a necessary severance from the intense emotional drama of the past months. Walking through ancient cathedral gardens and exploring the rough-hewn architecture of the coast, I felt the sharp edges of my grief and anxiety finally begin to soften. I was Carol Bennett again, not the frightened widow or the frantic detective. I was independent, solvent, and free. I called Brian every few days. He was immersed in the cottage and the Shelby. "I found Dad's notes on the differential oil," he told me one night, sounding excited. He wrote that he had sourced a specific vintage lubricant from a specialty supplier in Michigan. "It's ridiculous, but the attention to detail is amazing." "That's how he was about everything, honey," I reminded him. "He didn't do things halfway." "I know, and Mom," I painted the garage. A light gray. It feels like a workspace now, not just a holding bay. And I'm installing the sound system from his old office so I can listen to his jazz while I work. His voice was bright, filled with purpose. The void left by Vanessa was being steadily filled by the constructive legacy of his father. When I returned, Tom was there at the airport, waiting patiently. He handed me a single, perfect white orchid. "Welcome home, Carol. The house is secure, the Shelby is purring, and Brian is thriving." "Thank you, Tom. You're a remarkable friend." It was my honor. My first stop wasn't home, but Brian's new cottage. It was small, cozy, and distinctly his. No lingering remnants of Vanessa's expensive, transient tastes. The walls were painted a quiet, calming blue, and his old college bookshelves were unpacked and filled. The garage, freshly painted and organized, smelled of new wood and motor oil. The Shelby, parked neatly in the center, looked like royalty. "I started teaching the neighborhood kids about basic engine function," Brian confessed, leaning against the workbench. "Just 3 boys from down the street. They're fascinated by the V8. It's what Dad would have done, right?" "It's exactly what he would have done," I said, a deep wave of pride washing over me. Brian was not just healing, he was passing on the virtue of integrity that his father embodied. Life settled into a steady rhythm. Brian continued his therapy and his work on the Shelby. I returned to the ICU, my confidence and focus renewed. One day, Detective Ramirez called me. "Mrs. Bennett, Linda Marsh's sentencing is finalized. 12 years federal with no chance of parole for the first 8. The extradition hearings are done, and she'll be transferred to a facility in West Virginia next week." "It's over then," I murmured. "Legally, yes. She tried to give one last statement before her transfer. She claimed that she never intended to keep the money, that she was addicted to the game, the challenge of deception. She tried to paint herself as a victim of her own compulsion." "Do you believe her?" "No," Ramirez said flatly. but I wanted to give you and Brian one last piece of information. When we went through her seized hard drive, we found a journal. Not a physical one, but a digital log of her targets. Did she mention Dennis? She did, and she mentioned you. She called Dennis the architect, and you the rock. She wrote that she knew Dennis was onto her 6 months before his death, but she didn't realize how deep his investigation went. Ramirez paused, the line crackling faintly. She wrote that she had started small psychological warfare on him to break his focus. Comments about his memory, his health, his age. She was trying to destabilize him before he could expose her. I drew a sharp breath. Dennis's heart attack, the stress he was under. The psychological torment Vanessa had been inflicting. She suggested his heart attack might have been caused by the stress of his own paranoid imagination, Ramirez continued, her voice heavy with contempt. She took credit for the stress that preceded his death. She saw it as a victory. The line of thought, once a terrifying suspicion, was now confirmed. Dennis had been under relentless, targeted stress right up until the end. Vanessa hadn't physically killed him, but she had certainly contributed to the environment that led to his death. "Thank you, detective," I managed. I needed to know that. I didn't tell Brian the details. He had enough guilt to process, but I kept the knowledge close. It confirmed the urgency and the heroism of Dennis's final mission. He fought until his body failed him. The restitution checks came through 3 months later. Stanley Wright received about $12,000, and George Murphy received $10,500, drawn from the seized funds and liquidated assets. Stanley called me, sounding genuinely happy. "I'm dedicating the bulk of the funds to the community center in my mother's name, Carol. The rest is going into a college fund for my granddaughter." Something positive came out of that mess. George sent a photo of 3 high school boys standing proudly in front of a workbench, surrounded by wrenches and engine parts. The youth mechanics program is up and running. Thanks to Dennis. The ripple effect of Dennis's diligence continued, turning wreckage into repair. One Saturday afternoon, Brian and I decided to go through the last of Dennis's unsorted files, the documents from his medical practice. We sat together at the kitchen table, the silence comfortable and familiar. We went through insurance papers, tax forms, and old patient records. Brian picked up a large envelope marked TechCore Solutions. Inside were duplicates of the stock certificates I had found in the bank vault. He kept meticulous records, Brian noted. He even wrote down the ticker symbol and the closing price every quarter for a decade, even when the company was private. Then Brian pulled out a small, heavy velvet box. It was a jeweler's box, nestled among the documents. He opened it. Inside, resting on white satin, was a ring. Not an engagement ring, but a custom-made band of gold and platinum, etched with small, delicate filigree. There was a note taped to the inside lid. "For Carol, on our 30th, I promised to keep building." Our 30th wedding anniversary had been 5 months after Dennis died. He had bought it and hidden it, waiting for the perfect day to present it. Brian looked at me, his eyes full of tears. "He was still planning, Mom. He was going to surprise you." I gently took the ring from the box. The metal was cool against my skin. It wasn't the value of the ring, it was the promise. I promised to keep building. That was Dennis's vow, to keep building our life, our safety, our love. I slipped it onto my finger. It fit perfectly. "He wanted you to move forward, Carol," Brian whispered. "He wanted you to know he had a lifetime of plans for you." "I know, honey," I said, my voice thick. "And I'm going to honor them. I'm going to live that full, independent life he protected." Brian's therapy was nearing its end, and he was ready for a decisive break. He was thriving in his new cottage, had started dating tentatively, a quiet, kind woman who was a librarian at the university, and was talking about going back to school for an engineering certificate. One day he came over, his expression serious. "Mom, I need to know the whole story. I need to know why Dad kept it secret from you. Why he told Tom but not you." I paused, thinking about the heavy weight of the secret. "He did tell me, Brian," I admitted. "He just told me in a way he knew I would only understand after he was gone." I took him to the garage. The scent of fresh paint and oil was strong. I had never shown him the exact spot where I found the file. I pushed down on the leather panel in the driver's side door of the Shelby. It clicked, and the small, hidden cavity was revealed. "He hid the file here," I explained. "Not in a safe. Not in the house. He hid the truth in the heart of his creation, because he knew Vanessa would never touch the car. He knew the garage was his sanctuary, his private space." Brian stared at the spot. "He built a safe for his secrets." "He built a clue for me," I corrected him gently. "He knew that if I was ever in danger, Tom would tell me to look in the car. He knew I'd have to sit here in his spot to find the truth. He made me part of his investigation, but only when I was ready." I sat in the driver's seat, resting my hands on the familiar wooden wheel. "He didn't keep it secret out of distrust, Brian. He kept it secret because he was protecting my peace. He knew if he told me, I would have spent his last months living in panic, arguing with him, and putting myself in danger. He carried that burden alone so I could grieve him cleanly." Brian put his hand on my shoulder, looking at the empty compartment. "He was protecting you from the beginning. He was protecting us from the end," I whispered. "He wanted us to be safe, solvent, and together. He succeeded, honey. We're safe, we're solvent, and we're together." The realization that Dennis had shielded me from the painful, immediate knowledge of Vanessa's betrayal was the final act of emotional processing. Brian and I left the garage that day feeling lighter, the weight of the past finally manageable. The car was no longer a monument to grief, but a symbol of foresight and enduring love. The winter months passed, bringing a quiet, restorative peace. Brian flourished. He was accepted into an evening engineering program, balancing his office job with his studies and his work on the Shelby. He was careful, focused, and happy in a way he hadn't been since before he met Vanessa. He continued his weekly talks with Dr. Chen, and the conversations evolved from processing trauma to defining his future. One chilly Saturday morning, Brian arrived at my house carrying a leather-bound book. "I finished it," he announced, sitting down at the kitchen table. It was Dennis's engineering notebook, filled with detailed schematics, calculations, and philosophical musings on cars and life. "I found his initial concept drawings for the Shelby," Brian explained, flipping open the book. "He started sketching this car on napkins 30 years ago. He wrote that his greatest joy wasn't the final result, but the process of constant, careful improvement." Brian traced a faint pencil line on one page. "Look here, this is a note from 1999. It says, 'Future goal, teach B to re-weld an axle shaft. It's messy, complicated, and requires patience. Good practice for life.'" He always saw the mechanics as metaphors, I recalled, smiling. "He also wrote a page about his legacy," Brian said, his voice dropping. "It wasn't about the car, Mom. It was about knowledge." He read the entry. "The greatest gift I can give is not wealth, but the skill set to rebuild anything that breaks, be it a V8 engine or a trust. I want my son to understand that anything can be restored, provided you have the manual, the tools, and the belief that the system is worth saving." Brian closed the book. "I realized that Vanessa didn't just target our money. She targeted that belief. She wanted to break the system, to make me think you were declining, that Dad was paranoid, that our whole family history was worthless. And you proved her wrong," I finished for him. "We proved her wrong, and Dad gave us the manual to do it." As spring approached, I felt the renewed energy of the season. I decided to make another investment, one that honored both Dennis's financial foresight and my career as a nurse. I established the Dennis Bennett Memorial Scholarship at the local community college, designated for students pursuing careers in emergency medicine or mechanical trades. The initial funding came from a portion of the stock interest Dennis had left me. It was a modest but lasting tribute. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was small but meaningful. Brian, Tom, and I stood together as the college president unveiled a small plaque. Brian spoke briefly, his voice steady and strong. "My father, Dennis Bennett, believed in two things: the power of meticulous work and the importance of helping others. This scholarship honors both. He may not have been able to finish his final project, but because of the care he took, his legacy continues to build." I was so proud of him. He was standing on his own 2 feet, healed and whole, articulating his father's values with confidence. Later that evening, I pulled out the last remaining file in Dennis's home office. It was a folder marked personal insurance. Inside, among the life insurance policies, was an old, faded document I hadn't seen before, a handwritten living will and testament. It was dated 3 years prior, well before the Vanessa saga began. It detailed his final wishes regarding care, and at the bottom there was a final, touching addition. If I am unable to speak for myself, I want my wife, Carol, to be the final voice. She is a brilliant nurse, a fighter, and possesses the strongest moral compass I know. Trust her judgment above all. And when it's time, scatter my ashes at the Bonneville Salt Flats. I want one last run, even if it's only in spirit. A small laugh escaped me. Even in his serious legal documents, Dennis had to include a reference to his love of speed and racing. I realized then that Dennis hadn't just been preparing for a predator. He was preparing for life's inevitable end, ensuring that I was equipped, financially and emotionally, to handle whatever came next. He wanted me to be strong. My relationship with Brian continued to evolve. He was an adult now, no longer the dependent I was protecting. One Sunday, he came over for coffee and brought the librarian, Sarah. She was quiet, smart, and had a warmth about her that felt genuine and comforting. "Mom," Brian said, a nervous excitement in his voice, "Sarah and I have been seeing each other for a few months. I wanted you to meet her, properly." Sarah and I talked for hours. She listened patiently as I talked about my work at the ICU and my recent trip. I told her about Dennis, focusing on his humor and his methodical nature, omitting the dark chapter of Vanessa. Later, when Brian walked Sarah out, I saw them holding hands. It was an easy, natural connection, completely devoid of the forced glamour and demanding performance that characterized his relationship with Vanessa. When Brian returned, he was smiling broadly. "She's good, Mom, really good. I told her about everything, about Vanessa, about the therapy, about how careful I have to be now." "And what did she say?" "She said I was brave for choosing the truth over the fantasy, and she said she admires your strength. She's a keeper, Brian. She has good judgment." Brian nodded. "I learned my lesson. I'm not looking for the perfect image anymore. I'm looking for the honest connection." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place unexpectedly when Tom and I were having lunch. "I need to confess something, Carol," Tom said, stirring his coffee. "Something about the day Dennis died." "What is it, Tom?" "Dennis came into the garage that morning. He had the final piece of evidence, the last credit card statement for the unauthorized charges. He was going to meet Peter that afternoon to finalize the police report." Tom paused, his eyes troubled. "He looked stressed, Carol. He told me Vanessa had cornered him the night before, suggesting he needed professional help and that he was losing his grip. He knew she was escalating the psychological attack. She saw him as a threat," I murmured, recalling Detective Ramirez's words. "Yes, but he was also elated. He said, 'Tom, I've got enough. I can finally tell Carol and Brian they'll be safe now.' He was so close. He died right there in the garage, leaning against the workbench. The heart attack was massive and sudden." Tom's eyes met mine, filled with genuine regret. "I called 911 immediately, but it was too late. I closed the door, and the very first thing I did before the ambulance even arrived was find that file. I opened the compartment in the Shelby, slid the file in, and made sure the panel was locked. Then I closed the journal. 'You protected his evidence, Tom,' I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I protected his promise," Tom corrected. "I knew the police would swarm the office and the house, and I knew Vanessa would too. I made sure she wouldn't find the truth." "I knew you would. I knew you were the only person who could finish it." I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. "You are part of our safe harbor, Tom. You both were. Thank you for telling me." The full narrative was finally complete. Dennis had fought and prepared for months. Tom had executed the final act of protection. And I, armed with Dennis's foresight, had finished the mission. We were a team, protecting our own. The storm was over, and the long, slow, purposeful work of rebuilding had been successful. The years that followed were marked not by grand drama, but by quiet, continuous growth. Brian moved fully into his life. He completed his engineering certificate, quit his office manager job, and started working part-time for Tom at the garage, learning the complex restoration trade while he saved money to open his own small specialty shop. Sarah, the kind librarian, became his steady companion. The Shelby Cobra continued its service as a mechanical mentor. Brian spent countless hours tuning, polishing, and understanding every nuance of the vehicle. He drove it occasionally, but mostly he maintained it, respecting the machine and the legacy it represented. My life remained centered on the home Dennis had secured for me. I continued my work, wore the beautiful anniversary ring, and started taking the small, independent trips Dennis had planned for me, a cooking class in Italy, a botanical tour of Scotland. I lived deliberately, cherishing the independence that had been bought with such a high emotional price. I often thought of Vanessa, now Linda Marsh, serving her sentence far away. The rage and contempt she displayed at the airport felt like a distant, irrelevant nightmare. She was a consequence of her own greed, locked into the lonely reality she had tried to impose on others. Her ability to hurt us was extinguished. One late spring afternoon, 3 years after the confrontation, Brian and Sarah came over to share some important news. They were engaged. The ring Brian presented Sarah was a simple antique gold band, chosen not for size or flash, but for its history and durability. It was the antithesis of the luxury and pretense that Vanessa demanded. "It's perfect, Brian," I said, tears of happiness stinging my eyes as I hugged Sarah. "We talked about getting married next year," Brian said, beaming. "Small ceremony, and Mom, I wanted to ask you for one thing. Anything, honey. I want you to walk me down the aisle, you and Tom, and I want the Shelby to be part of the day." A symbol of the family that survived and the future we're building. It was the ultimate confirmation that the healing was complete. Brian wasn't hiding from the past. He was integrating it, using its strength to define his future. On the day of the wedding, the sun shone brightly. Brian, impeccably dressed, stood beside the gleaming burgundy Shelby, waiting for his bride. The car, polished to perfection, was decorated simply with white garden roses. Tom and I walked Brian halfway down the aisle. As we handed him over, Tom clapped him on the shoulder, his eyes warm with pride. "Your dad would be raising the roof right now, son." I squeezed Brian's hand, feeling the strength of his own confidence. "He's here, honey. He's always been here." As Sarah walked toward Brian, radiant and true, I glanced back toward the Shelby. It was the final, perfect testament to the methodical love of Dennis Bennett. He had built the car. He had built the file. He had built the protective wall around his family. He may have died, but his purpose lived on, enshrined in the careful mechanics of his creation and the secure, honest life of his son. The fight was over. The family was whole, and we were finally, truly safe.